This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is Katelyn McCullock, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, with this week's Cattle Market Update. She recaps the markets as well as the Consumer Price Index and Advanced Retail Sales Reports. K-State's Reid and Ashlee Westerhold from the Agricultural Economics Department keep the show going as they preview the first ever Landowner Conference. Wrapping up today's show is K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. He discusses the different species of vultures and why people might be seeing them and how they can be dispersed. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week, we're joined with the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock. Katelyn, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Katelyn, starting off the cattle market conversation with what is cash cattle market looking like?
Well, if I vary daily weighted average cattle for negotiated popped back up at the end of this week. We closed the week out, last week, I should say, at 185.12 for live FOB and 186.28 for live delivered. So those are price improvements from kind of the low to mid 170 or the mid to high 170s that we saw in the last couple of weeks.
And what is futures contracts then looking like?
You know, the futures have been a little bit bumpy as well. They ended last week up about $1.50 in the nearby for 2023 contracts and up a little bit less, 1.3 across most of 2024. Now, one thing that was interesting is April 2024 right now is knocking on $200 per hundredweight. And so it'll be very exciting to see it break that. We're at what we closed Friday at 199.75. So very, very strong prices out there. Almost all the contracts in 2024 are now over 190. Quite a few of them are over 195.
Some pretty high prices then. And are you seeing some of that increases also in box beef cutout?
Box beef cutout has managed to hold the 300, or choice box beef cutout has managed to hold the 300 level. Last week we closed at 305.71. That is on the downward trend. We've sort of eased a little bit lower for several weeks now, coming off that high that we saw earlier this summer. Now, the question is, how low does that choice box beef get? I don't anticipate it falling a lot further. The kill levels have been a little bit smaller in recent weeks, and I think that'll be relatively supportive of that beef price.
As we're kind of exiting summer and entering into the fall, grilling season is kind of wrapping up. And so are you seeing those effects then in the cattle market?
We're certainly seeing it in what prices are doing relative to primals. And we should see that change over here relatively soon to focus more on middle meats as we enter that holiday season. Generally speaking, box beef outlook looks relatively supportive, and so does live cattle prices. But, we talk a lot about consumer demand. There's no evidence that that's waning at this point. And so we're fairly optimistic that we can hold these levels and maybe even push a little bit higher into the fourth quarter.
Mentioning consumers there, now talking about the Consumer Price Index and possibly from a recent report and a Fed meeting coming up, possibly some interesting work going in there.
So the Consumer Price Index is commonly referred to as CPI, and it's a tool that economists use. It's a relative basket of goods to measure relative prices year over year relative to each other. So in all items CPI, that rose about 3.7% in August relative to last year. But the Federal Reserve, when they're looking at interest rates, one of the key numbers they look at is the core inflation number, which is the CPI, which is that all item CPI minus food and energy, and that rose 4.3%. So it's not quite to that 2% level that they're trying to get to, and that'll probably impact how they're viewing it, but it's not the only number the Federal Reserve looks at when they're preparing for interest rates. Federal Reserve is meeting the week of 9/18, and so we'll see if they're going to decide to, at that moment, give an interest rate hike. But I think what this data shows is that we're probably in for another interest rate hike between now and the end of the year, whether or not it's decided in September at a different meeting. I think remains to be seen. The other thing that maybe is more outside the scope of the Federal Reserve and interest rate conversation is that the CPI, you can break it down into a lot of different things. And one of the interesting things about this number is that it does compile it into the food and beverage space, which is up 4.2%. So another strong increase in what people have had to spend relative to last year on just food and drinks. And then the meats, of course, is more applicable maybe to this audience. They were up 2.6%. Now, the poultry CPI actually fell below a year ago for the second month in a row. So that means that relative to last year, people are spending less on poultry year over year, but not by much, down only 0.1%. Dairy-related products are up about 0.25% in August, and that's a welcome sign that that's slowing down because those had seen some bigger gains earlier in this year. The CPI also breaks down things like housing, energy, apparel, and some of those have seen some strong increases. The largest year-over-year gain was in that housing index, so up 5.7%. Apparel and recreation gained more than 3% each. Transportation, about a 1.4% increase, and then education and communication rose 1%. So some of the more interesting declines, which we don't think of these things as really ever getting cheaper, but medical care declined a full 1% from last year, which I thought was surprising. And energy down, still a large decrease year over year, down 4.6%. So that's really still keying off some of those Ukraine issues last year. So not maybe as big of a surprise to see that. So we're all waiting to see what the Federal Reserve does here in the next couple of weeks and what that'll mean for agricultural producers. But overall, the Consumer Price Index showed that inflation is still quite a bit stronger than maybe what the Federal Reserve would like, and that people are generally still paying more than they were a year ago for most things.
So they're paying more, but they're not getting more items?
So that's an interesting question, Shelby, because this data doesn't necessarily take into account the sales volume, whereas another piece of data that came out last week was the advanced retail sales, and that's put out by the U.S. Census Bureau. And what that does is it actually totals the total number of sales, and it's more difficult to tell from that perspective whether it's an increase in foot traffic, as in people buying more items, or if it's just that things are more expensive. So the CPI really tells us that prices specifically are more expensive, where the sales report is trying to get at maybe a little bit more both that quantity and price type of thing. So when we look at the advanced retail sales, the unadjusted monthly data was about a 2.9% for all retail food and services. And that also breaks out into a few different categories. But I think one of the biggest things that struck me was food and drinking places. So that's characterized as restaurants and bars. And if you've walked around Manhattan lately or here in Denver, you can be the judge of whether you think there's more people going out to eat or less. That category is up 9.1% over a year ago. And so I think it's probably a little bit of both, that you probably are seeing just generally check prices are higher because food is more expensive, but you still probably have some fairly robust foot traffic coming through there. The other thing I like to look at, and this isn't data that came out recently, this is still dated in July, the Restaurant Performance Index gives us a little bit better idea of foot traffic. So that's one of the key indicators that they use in their survey. Again, this is July, but they've said since March that foot traffic has been down year over year. And so that also makes me believe that probably most of this increase in that sales data is really coming from how expensive things have gotten. But still, 9.1% over a year ago on eating and drinking places is an enormous increase.
How does all this play together into the cattle market, and what does it mean for our cattle producers?
It's difficult to maybe come away with a bite-sized soundbite here for what producers should take away, because it really tells you that the economy picture isn't very clear right now. There is some conflicting data in terms of, the labor market does seem to be easing up a bit. But if the Federal Reserve continues to hike rates, what does that mean? Generally speaking, consumers are still being hit with inflation, but we really haven't seen a lot of cracks in the economy where it feels like the recession is here. I still am in the camp that I think we're going to have one, and that might mean some slowdown in those meat purchases. However, we really haven't seen any evidence of that. I mean, the beef market really has remained quite strong. through lots of black swan events and shocks over the last couple of years. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens should we do have a recession. I think the retail level, there's probably room for retailers to squeeze their margins a little bit before you actually see an impact on the live cattle price, or even the box beef price. And packer margins are relatively weak compared to history. And so there's maybe not as many levers as they can pull as well. And so all of that plays into a fairly complicated situation right now for the cattle markets. But probably still the overarching theme for cattle producers is that cattle supplies are tight and prices probably continue to look better. That even with all of this stuff going on, these longer biological production systems still indicate that prices are very likely to be stable to higher for the next 2 years.
Katelyn, if people would like to read these reports or read work from the Livestock Marketing Information Center, where can they do that?
They can come to www.lmic.info.
Katelyn, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
Thank you.
That was Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock. You can find the Livestock Marketing Information Center's website at lmic.info. Again, that is lmic.info. I will also link it in today's show notes, which, as always, you're able to find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we're going to be joined with K-State's Reid and Ashlee Westerhold from the Agricultural Economics Department as they discuss a new conference, the Landowner Conference. We're cutting to that break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now discussing an upcoming event from K-State's Agricultural Economics Department. And we're joined by K-State's agricultural economist Reid and the director of the Office of Farm and Ranch Transition, Ashlee Westerhold, to talk about it. Ashlee, Robin, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Robin, this upcoming event is the inaugural Landowner Conference, and so who is this event for?
Well, this is a brand new conference that we're starting this year out of the Agricultural Economics Department. And really the basis for doing this is we recognize there is a growing demographic of landowners here in Kansas that are becoming more geographically and generationally removed from agriculture. Some of the research that I'm doing right now is looking at who are our Kansas landowners. And back in 2015, I can show about 85% of our land here in Kansas by acre was still owned by landowners living here in Kansas. As we move forward, I looked again last year, 2022, again, some ongoing research, but we can already pick up a shift in more land being owned out of state. And some of that's due to inheritance, some of that's due to just purchasing, especially hunting ground right now in the state of Kansas. But we also know the number one question in our county offices, or even my office across the state, is landowners wanting to know going rates, wanting to know lease statute, lease law. And so this conference is really designed to help landowners that own Kansas farm ground or pasture to really get a comprehensive program on land ownership, land management, land lease law, everything like that in one day in-person conference.
Hopefully then helping those landowners be a little bit more knowledgeable when working with maybe that farmer that's renting the land from them.
Yeah, absolutely. We did a whole series on this last winter. There's so much that we want to emphasize, how to have a good relationship between a landowner and tenant, and communication, and getting a lease in writing, and all the different things that should be in it to really help streamline the process of managing a land lease and avoiding conflict. And I think we're going to be presenting a lot of things during this one-day conference that'll really help the landowner understand agriculture, what's going on in the ag economy right now, and how to work with their tenant efficiently to have a successful relationship.
And Ashlee, you're in the Office of Farm and Ranch Transition, and a lot of land is being kind of moved over from generation to generation and maybe a little bit more separation from agriculture, and you're expecting that number to continue to expand.
Yeah, so in Kansas right now, about 66% of the farms in Kansas are owned and operated by someone 55 and older. So if you think about that, in the next 15 years when they're going towards that age of 70, you would think that they start retiring or thinking of transferring land. And so if 66% of our Kansas ag land is owned by people that might be retiring in 15 years, we're going to see a huge wave of ownership transfer from one generation to the next. So according to the Land Trust, they did a recent study and they said 40% of all ag land will go into some sort of ownership transfer in the next 15 years. I say in Kansas it might even be larger. But those tenant relationships, we have a Kansas Land Link program that these absentee landowners or landowners that don't live on the farm and are looking for even a tenant to start that relationship, to start those conversations. These are tools that we have on K-State campus that maybe they're not familiar with, that this conference is bringing to them of saying, this is how you even find a tenant. This is where to start. This is what's going on in our economy. And so not only people that are inheriting ground maybe outside of Kansas ground that they're inheriting and they live outside of Kansas, but even people who live in the big cities, Kansas City, Wichita. As I am in my role working with families going through transition planning, we're seeing a lot more family members that are living in larger cities. They like the amenities. They do not necessarily have plans to come back to the farm, but they want to keep ownership of the farm. And so even if your children grew up on the farm, they might still have questions on how to do these leases. Why is it important for them to have these conversations? And why should we talk about this in transition planning and succession planning for children that won't live on the farm someday? So how can even they become better landowners once they inherit the farm?
A big thing I feel like you talk about, Ashlee, is always taking the time to plan ahead and getting your ducks in a row before you need them. And so what are a few of those different topics that are going to be covered at this conference?
Yeah, so we're very excited because we have just the breadth of the Ag Econ department. And so we have really land values, lease rates, farm transition planning, lease basics and communications, property tax regulations. We will talk about how to use our Ag Manager website for those who are not coming to Kansas or not living in Kansas, but Ag Manager has so much information, how to use that. What are the components of a good written lease? And we are having Roger McCohen come and talk about a legal written lease and what you need to have so that it is legal. You should probably have written leases. There's my plug right there. We'll also talk about strategic alliances for successful tenant relationships, and then we'll have a lot of networking opportunities. So a lot of people in these conferences feel as if they don't necessarily relate to people, but in this conference, you're all coming together because you're Kansas landowners, and you get to relate to each other of how do you handle this situation and learn from each other. So we're excited to offer a lot of networking opportunities in this conference as well.
And that includes networking time with our specialists. So not only are we all speakers on the conference, but we're going to be there during our social at the end, networking lunch, breakfast in the beginning. As Ashlee said, we have a lot of built-in time there where you can talk one-on-one with our specialists in the Ag Econ department about these topics, because it's not always easy to ask a question in front of the whole audience, but being able to connect one-on-one with all of our specialists is going to be a big incentive of this conference too.
When is this happening, and how do people go about getting registered for the event?
So because we are a part of Kansas State University, we are excited about our football team, and we wanted to make sure that we are having a conference so that if there are people who love K-State and are big football fans, we are having it the Friday, November 10th, before the November 11th Baylor game. And so we are bringing people into the Alumni Center so they can come feel the excitement on campus before a game day. And so November 10th, it will be an all-day event. It will start at 8 a.m. for registration, and it will end after social hour. And so we are very excited. Again, November 10th, 2023. And we have registration. It is open. We have early bird right now, and that goes until October 15th. And so the cost is $250 per person. But we're excited about this opportunity to really branch out of maybe our normal programming to make sure that we are targeting those who need this assistance, who are interested in really being the best Kansas landowner that they can be.
And along with that, if you do register for the conference, we do have a block of tickets for the Baylor game that landowners can get a ticket to the game and, as Ashlee said, enjoy the atmosphere of K-State. I know a lot of our Kansas landowners are K-State alumni, so this is a really great opportunity to both take in the conference and a football game.
And as we wrap up our conversation, what makes you guys excited to be kind of kicking this Landowners Conference off?
My excitement is I do talk to a lot of landowners across the state, and meeting some of them one-on-one is going to be really neat. I had a landowner just the other day I was talking to on the phone, and she said, I've been to Kansas or Manhattan, Kansas one time and how great of a town it was. And I said, well, come back again. We're doing a Landowner Conference just for you. So I think it's just a new conference, new excitement, also K-State football game, but I really hope landowners take advantage of this opportunity.
I think my excitement comes from the fact that I've never seen someone put on a conference like this for this demographic. There's a lot of conferences that we target to operators in Kansas, but really targeting those landowners and very specifically targeting this group is something I haven't seen done before. And I will shout out to Dr. Featherstone for really coming up with this idea and wanting to pursue this. And I think it's going to be hopefully great. I believe it will be. And I'm very excited for that opportunity to do something completely out of the box.
Ashlee, is it fair to say then you recommend people who are renting land now to others or possibly could be in the future take the time to attend this event?
Yeah, even if you're going from full-time operator and you're saying, hey, I want to retire, maybe I don't have anyone right now interested in coming back, what kind of lease agreements are there out there? And I've only been operating, so I haven't had to put on this hat of landowner as much as people who don't live on the farm. And so there's opportunities for anyone as they move towards being solely landowner versus operator. Again, if you think your children will operate from afar one day, this might be a great conference for them to attend. So again, we want people to be the most educated landowners and manage their Kansas land as best they can.
How do people go about registering for this event?
The best way to go is on our website, www.agmanager.info/landowner. And again, agmanager.info/landowner.
That was K-State agricultural economist Robin Reid, and she was joined by the director of the Office of Farm and Ranch Transition, Ashlee Westerhold. I will place the registration link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we finish our Monday show, as we always do, with some information from the Wildlife Department here at K-State. And today we're joined with K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Drew, you mentioned you've been getting a lot of questions about vultures, so sharing some information about them. And what vultures are people probably seeing in Kansas?
So in Kansas, the most common species of vulture that we see throughout the state is the turkey vulture. There is also the black vulture that can be present in Kansas, but they are not very abundant. They have been detected as far north as Salina and Russell, but typically that species is going to be much more common down right along the Oklahoma border, and especially in extreme southeast Kansas, so like Riverton, Baxter Springs, that part of the state's where we see the most of them.
Since the 1960s, have seen quite a few more vultures than we used to.
The North American population of turkey vultures has more than doubled since the 60s, and the North American population of black vultures has increased more than 6 times since the 1960s.
Why this time of year are people starting to see more vultures together, possibly?
So this time of the year, turkeys are getting into their flocks or groups that they're going to migrate with. That's the main reason that we see congregations of them this time of the year. Of course, the vultures that were produced over the summer, the chicks are also becoming adults that are flying around and that sort of thing too. So we see more of that for that reason. But really the biggest reason that we see congregations this time of the year is that they're clustering up, getting ready to migrate south for the winter.
Drew, is it fair to say that vultures do provide some good?
They're kind of one of our cleanup crews, right? They eat a lot of dead things that a biologist like me would call carrion. There's one group that did a research project on this that estimated that turkey vultures provide an ecological service of about $700 million to North America for their cleanup activities. Whether or not that number is accurate, it's hard to say, but needless to say, they clean up a lot of dead stuff, and that's a very nice service that they do provide for us.
People have been having some concerns.
The type of call that I get that doesn't involve loss of animals would be turkey vultures that are roosting in towns. So they do like to roost on water towers. They will also roost in large trees and on cell phone towers and that sort of thing. The other type of call that I get involves livestock. So black vultures are known to kill young livestock, sometimes sick livestock. They are considered a lower tier predator of livestock. But turkey vultures rarely do this. There are some situations where they will attack or kill young livestock, but it's very, very rare. Both species like to congregate around calving areas because they like to clean up the afterbirth. And sometimes when they're there to clean up the afterbirth, the black vultures especially are an opportunistic predator that will peck out the eyes, peck out the soft tissue around the mouth or the anus or the umbilical cord area of calves and lambs and goat kids and those sorts of vulnerable livestock.
So for producers who are having congregations and really would rather them not be there, what are a few ways they could control that?
Turkey vultures are the most common one that we're going to see, and they're not likely to be killing livestock. But if we want to disperse them, the best way to keep those away from our calving areas is going to be to disperse that roost. And we do that by hanging up either a real dead vulture or a fake dead vulture in the roost or near the roost or even in the pasture where we may be calving at. And it's not likely that you're going to quickly be able to get your hands on a real dead vulture because we have to get a permit through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in order to do that. But we can make a fake dead vulture out of a stall mat, and there are some really good plans available through the University of Kentucky about how to do that. And that's sort of the first step. Sometimes just that fake dead vulture, which we would call an effigy, will disperse the roost. Other times we have to pair some noise making with that, and you could do that with a shotgun, just making sure not to shoot actually towards the birds because you don't want to injure them because they are federally protected. The other way would be to get what we call bird bangers, and these are shot from like a cap gun that uses a .22 blank, and then it's like a firecracker. It'll whistle. Sometimes they go bang, but that noise can startle them too. The bangers by themselves typically don't do a good job of dispersing a roost, but when we pair those with the effigy, that two-pronged approach can be very effective.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.